So that sets the table. There's much to talk about, so let's get right to our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Lu Xiankun. He's served as a senior negotiator for China at the World Trade Organization. Merrill Matthews is a resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation in Dallas. With us here in Washington is Arthur Dong. He's a professor at Georgetown University School of Business and an advisor to U.S. companies in China. And Yan Liang focuses on China's economy and international trade as an associate professor at Willamette University in Portland, Oregon. Let's start there in Portland. Yan Liang, this is a pretty comprehensive response that we heard from China. Owen already got into the part where they talked about bullying, but they go on to say that the U.S. has been brazenly preaching unilateralism, protectionism, making false accusations against countries and regions, particularly China. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think so. So in this 36,000-word document, Beijing tried to avoid calling names. But at the same time, it firmly denounced the American First agenda that undermines bilateralism. And it also showed that it's going to continue, follow the WTO rules, advocate multilateralism and free trade, and pledge to open its economy and reform. But at the same time, it also portrays itself as the victim, but not the perpetrator of this trade tension. And of course, this is a white paper, but it shows no white flag. So China is not going to give in. It's going to continue with its own, economic agenda and retaliate the U.S.'s sort of as what they call as the trade bullism.
And Merrill, I suspect that Donald Trump is not going to be waving the white flag anytime soon either. But in this report, they say that trade protectionism will ultimately harm the United States. It's going to push up manufacturing costs. It's going to cost American jobs. It's going to hike up prices for a lot of Americans going to the store. I mean, we're talking about binders and calculators, your routers for your Wi-Fi, even your brakes in your car, your tires, all of those things. The U.S. National Taxpayers Union is warning of higher prices as well. Do you agree?
Well, I think the higher prices are coming, and in fact, some are already here. But Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said just in the last day or two that this is a war that he thinks we can win, and they want to go forward with it. I looked at the paper, the white paper that came out, and I think it makes some good points in there. One important point is that China sees its trade imbalance with the U.S. at a much lower rate because China tends to do the value added. We ship a lot of things to China, they add value to it, and they ship it out. And the U.S., the way the U.S. tends to track this is to take the whole value of that rather than the value added in China, and that makes the trade imbalance look a lot higher than I think it actually is. So I think that part of the paper is actually right. On the other hand, it still wants to try to deny some of the things that Americans have been alleging for some time, especially on the tech transfer and the intellectual property theft. And I just don't think it's going to convince many people here.
But Merrill, what about, I mean, on the front page of the Washington Post today, they had a story about Cedar Electronics. They make CBs for truckers. If there's ever a Trump voter, it seems like it'd be the truckers making their way across the United States. One of the executives said, my government just clubbed me over the head. He said that these tariffs are going to be really dramatic for his company. It's a small business, the type of companies that Trump says he's trying to protect. He says there's probably going to be layoffs. He's going to have to hike the prices. You can't turn a light switch on and off. He can't move the manufacturing out of China somewhere else overnight. These are some of the companies that are going to take the hit, aren't they?
Oh, that's absolutely right. Some of his biggest defenders are taking the hit on this. When you listen to them discussing this, most of them say, we're prepared to go for this for a little while if this gets resolved in the next 3 or 4 months. If it's long-term, it's going to be devastating for our business. That includes some of the fishing industries, the lobster industries, the agriculture. There's a lot of industries that are being hit by this. It's going to ultimately push up prices. Trump says he hasn't seen that happen yet, but we'll certainly see it before long. And interestingly from this, if it pushes up prices, that sort of encourages the Fed to raise the interest rates and create more problems there because Donald Trump wants them actually to lower the interest rates or keep them the same. So he's fighting himself in some ways on this.
Well, and Walmart and Target are warning that it will impact working families. Lu Xiankun, President Trump has been critical of China's trade practices. You just heard Merrill list some of those. He's been very outspoken about this trade deficit, very concerned about it. What is China prepared to do to try and meet the United States halfway if they can?
I think that if you read carefully this white paper, you will see that China is giving a very sober assessment about the situation. And about the title, you would notice that instead of calling it a trade war, it called it China-U.S. trade frictions. So I think that's a way that China trying to play down the impact of these two bilateral relations, and also, of course, on many aspects. Another thing is that in the white paper, China did, while criticizing the kind of unilateralism of the United States, China did recognize that, say that in the paper, China is not perfect. And so I think that's in a way give leeway for the both sides to sit down to discuss what are the concerns on each side and how to resolve them. And of course, China also trying to play kind of send some signals, which I think will be important for Trump administration to take note, is that China still committed to improve to the improvement of bilateral relations and still stick to multilateralism. So I think that China is trying to keep the door open for mutual kind of meetings and negotiations and trying to resolve the issues. I think those are the things we need to be mindful.
Mm-hmm. Arthur, we mentioned that you advise U.S. companies that operate in China. I'm sure they advise you. What's that dialogue going like? What are you hearing from them, and what are you suggesting to them? How do you ride something like this out?
Well, there's a lot of concerns being expressed by American companies right now in terms of the directionality of where this entire debate is going to head. There's a great deal of uncertainty with regard to their present investments in China and whether or not they should consider pulling out of the Chinese marketplace, both from a manufacturing point of view, as the tariffs really start to kick in. They haven't really fully kicked in yet, but certainly today was a watershed moment with $200 billion of additional tariffs. What will the near-term future look like a year from now? Should they be considering other places in which to put their factories, such as Vietnam and Cambodia? And so these are all creating greater uncertainty in terms of the investment horizon and also in terms of the U.S. marketplace and the impact on their consumers in America of how these prices are finally going to reflect in terms of what it's going to cost consumers for the products that they've come used to in terms of the pricing.
But the story I mentioned in the Washington Post, the guy illustrates the point that even if he wants to move things to Vietnam or somewhere else, there's a transition period. I mean, you're going to take a hit over an extended period of time. Is the concern, geez, do I make this move or do I try and ride this thing out?
Well, these are very difficult questions because moving is not exactly an easy thing to do if you have a fairly large manufacturing enterprise with hundreds of employees, and those employees are currently well trained in China and producing at a very, very, at maximum efficiency. That's not something you just destroy overnight. And in addition to that, going into these newer markets, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, including political risk, including investment risk, including the ability to even get your items to port and all the parts that you need into those new destinations in those new countries. Tremendous amount of friction with regard to implementing a new location for alternate sourcing of manufacturing.
Yan Liang, I saw you nodding your head. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so according to one of the recent business surveys, AmCham, China and AmCham Shanghai did a survey to 340 U.S. companies in China, and over 2/3 of them said they're not considering relocating their businesses because, again, it's very difficult to relocate and rebuild their global supply chain. That said, I think this turned out to be a very long, drawn-out trade war, and that could definitely hit the business's bottom line and make them, change their minds. That said, I also think that things could be more complicated because if companies are targeting at the Chinese market, they might want to actually operate in China to avoid, the heightened tariff rates from the U.S. exports. On the other hand, if the companies are operating in China but trying to, ship their goods back to the United States, then I think they would more considering leaving China.
Yan Liang, let me stay with you. China, Canada, Mexico, Russia, the EU, Turkey, they've all taken countermeasures against U.S. trade policy. They've filed lawsuits at the WTO, according to this white paper. Now, President Trump has threatened to pull out of the WTO. He says that the U.S. is being traded unfairly by the WTO. Does he have a point there?
Well, I think he's really trying to challenge the entire multilateralism trading system. And he does not see that the WTO is being unbiased. He actually recently pronounced that the United States is a developing country, so the U.S. should also enjoy the same kind of preferential benefits that WTO confers to its developing members. And that it's, he has very deep distrust in the WTO, which I don't think is necessarily founded. If you look at the past, the United States pretty much won over 90% of the trade disputes settlements that the United States brought to the WTO. So I think he is fundamentally changing his mind and challenging the multilateral system, and WTO is just a scapegoat.
Lu Xiankun, you've represented China in some of these grievances in the past. How long do they take, and what are the steps China can take to try and address this?
I think that it's difficult to say how long it takes. And also, of course, it's not a one-sided story that could only be done by China. I think for this to happen, I think both sides, in particular Trump administration, need to really kind of clear up the mindset on how to resolve this instead of how to escalate this. I think there are a lot of things should be done in the near future. The first thing is, of course, that WTO is there, and like it or not, there are many things you could discuss there. Either use WTO dispute settlement, or use WTO negotiating function, trying to resolve those issues which you think are not covered by the WTO. So the channels are there multilaterally. Bilaterally is even more important. As the white paper said, that there are a lot of the bilateral kind of forum or channels which were established by both sides, be it strategic dialogue and senior contacts, all those things are now cut off by the Trump administration. That's very dangerous. I think that the Trump should really take the time to think about how to restart those or to establish new ones so that both sides could sit down. So I think that multilaterally, bilaterally, they should sit down and discuss. How long it takes, it depends on the political will from both sides, in particular from the Trump administration.
Arthur, let me ask you this question, because I want you because you teach this stuff. Talk to me about this dichotomy. I mean, we think about the Bretton Woods system that came about after the Second World War. It was the United States, its Western allies. The IMF came out of that, the World Trade Organization. All of these things are kind of as a result of Bretton Woods. And yet right now, China adhering to it. I listed off all these others that are going with their complaints, their suits. And it's the U.S. that wants to pull away from this. Make sense of it for us. Well,
this is again, the dilemma that the world is facing today. These institutions that were established primarily by the United States to promote global trade and to, in a sense, preserve and spread the benefits of peace as a result of a community of interest surrounding trade. Well, under the current administration, we're seeing a dismantling of all these traditional institutions that have offered, to a great extent, both predictability and stability to the global trading system.
And Merrill, let me go to you, because one of the criticisms we're hearing from President Trump is that these targeted tariffs coming from China are aimed at his voters in the Midwest. He feels as though they're trying to influence or impact this upcoming election. I want to get your sense on that.
Well, I think he's right about that. I mean, I think there's a widespread opinion that whereas Donald Trump sort of threw haphazard tariffs out there, targeting steel and other things, the Chinese were much more strategic in what they imposed their tariffs on as a way to try to hit the president's supporters. And I think it's having something of an effect on that. In addition to that, it's creating... Donald Trump wanted to drain the swamp in Washington. What you've got now is thousands of companies applying to the Commerce Department, trying to get an exemption from the tariffs, with other companies that might be their competitors or suppliers weighing in on whether or not they deserve those tariffs. It is the definition of the swamp that's happened in that part of it. So it's one of the reasons why we need to get past this fairly quickly, because you're creating all kinds of inefficiencies that we don't want to have in the system.
Lu Xiankun, I want to get your thoughts on that. Do you agree that perhaps these tariffs were designed to influence voters?
I think that if you look carefully at the products, I mean, including the soybean and others, autobahns, I think that in a way this would, of course, affect the U.S. election in a way. Of course, whether the voters would buy it, I mean, it remains to be seen. But one thing I want to emphasize here is that whatever is targeted, it does not serve the interests of neither sides, because everyone is going to lose from this. I think that's the very key issue that both sides should be mindful. And not only two of them, but actually many beyond them. I mean, a lot of, we're talking about by other panelists, this global supply chain. A lot of countries along in the Asia and also beyond Asia are going to be affected by this. And as other panelists say, that it's difficult to redesign this supply chain and relocate. And even I was reading a paper yesterday that even when we talk about textile, and some of the products are relocated to Vietnam, which actually were supposed to be cheaper than China, but actually the situation is different. The final production cost is actually higher than in China. So there are many things behind this which make life difficult for everyone, including China and others.
Yan Liang, I wanted to.
And Mike, let me just weigh in on that about the voters. In the generic ballots in the U.S., the Democrats are doing much better than Republicans. Now, there are several reasons for that, but at least one of those may be the fact that of some discontent with the tariffs that are coming in.
Well, Merrill, let me ask you one follow-up on that. You know, the interesting thing about Donald Trump's first year in office, his crowning achievement legislatively was tax cuts. And yet here we are. I mean, you're looking basically at tax increases on handbags, shampoo, dog food, seasonings, even baseball gloves for your kids. How do you square those two if you're the Republicans going out there and trying to sell, hey, here's our big achievement, tax cuts, but here come these tariffs, which are really tax increases?
Well, he tends to not focus on the tax part of it. In fact, he had a tweet last week in which he said the tariffs are going into effect. This is going to mean a lot of new revenue for the U.S. coffers. And I thought to myself, do you understand that that revenue is coming from U.S. consumers? He often speaks as if this actually hammers consumers or people in other countries, but the tariffs are actually taxes on us.
Yan Liang, I want to talk to you about tariffs because one of the things that I think people get fixated on are these numbers, 50 billion here, 200 billion there. But not all tariffs are created equal. I mean, if you're a soybean farmer in the Midwest, you sell those soybeans to China. If that market's closed off, China can go to Argentina and get soybeans, and that's going to hurt you as a farmer. I mean, not all of these tariffs are the same. So talk to me about that.
Right. So I think you're right. I think these tariffs actually would create far-reaching impact on many different sectors and industries. And of course, ultimately, the U.S. consumers foot the bill. So for farming community, yes, they're getting this $12 billion of subsidies from Trump. But at the same time, China has bought, 1/3 of the U.S. soybean export last year to the amount of, close to $14 billion. And so that $12 billion does not really necessarily help to cover the entire loss, not to mention the soybean price has dropped by 15 to 20%. And with the price drop in soybean, other agricultural products like wheat, corn would also see their price go down. So I think for the farming community, they are, in a way suffering from this. And for retail industries, they also had the same issue. Some of the small businesses simply cannot absorb the costs or pass the cost on to consumers. And even for the high-tech industry, an industry that is arguably, be protected and promoted by these tariffs, we're also voicing their concerns, with the increased tariffs on a lot of the gear that support, internet, the mobile network, and data storage. These high-tech companies are also having a hard time. They are seeing increasing costs, difficulty in sourcing globally, and also, getting to markets. So I think you're right. Not all tariffs are created equal, but they all have very, negative consequences.
And Arthur, let me kind of riff off that for a little bit, because if you're a lobster fisherman and they're buying, now they're not buying, and it's not just the soybeans, it's pig snouts. I mean, some of these markets are very unique, and yet one of the arguments in the book Fear by Bob Woodward is this scene where Gary Cohn, a top economic advisor, says, don't do this. We don't make antibiotics in this country. What are you going to say to a mother who's got a 5-year-old who needs antibiotics? You got to get them from China. The reasoning behind this, give me your sense, because all these tariffs are different, and yet some of these products are desperately needed, some not so.
Well, this comes at the worst possible time for American farmers. American soybean producers, a very large proportion of what they make goes to China, and now that's gone poof, it's disappeared. And by the way, the world output of soybean has been expanding rapidly. So American farmers in the Farm Belt have not only been confronting problems with trade with China, they're confronting global expansion of capacity. In Brazil alone, they've added the equivalent of the size of Texas, 2 Texas-size states in terms of total acreage devoted to soybean. So American farmers are confronting that competitive pressure with a global glut of soybean coming from all over the world, and now President Trump just pulled the rug right out from under them, meaning making their life a lot harder. And that's why you see this growing chorus of opposition in the Farm Belt, because they know, first of all, despite the fact that there have been subsidies announced, they all know how Washington works. What's been announced is a far cry from what's actually allocated. So the headline number sounds great. What is actually appropriated is a totally different story, and farmers are aware of that. So maybe next year it's going to be a tough year.
And the subsidies to the farmers, that's not enough.
Not enough. And oftentimes, not only is the subsidy not enough, oftentimes it's not appropriated. In other words, those funds actually aren't there.
Lu Xiankun, one of the things that I found interesting is I was reading some of the material to get ready for this. Obama had his pivot to Asia, which a lot of people in China saw as containment. A lot of people are looking at this now and concerned that the U.S. is trying to contain China again. Is that a sentiment you hear there in Beijing?
There are many people in China and in Beijing are talking about this. Of course, China does see that kind of pressure from the U.S. in the Asia region. But of course, on the other side, China also say that many big players are having a role here. So I think that people should sit down and discuss. Be it containment or not, I think the cards are in the hands of both sides and try to see how do we deal with this instead of thinking about what's behind this. I think that's the key thing to say. But one thing, Mike, if you allow me about this soybean thing and also the voters, I want to add one word to that. Other than kind of sourcing from other areas, other than kind of trying to import from others, China has also been trying to do something domestically. The first thing is that China is increasing more in production in China of soybeans. Second thing is that the Chinese animal feed industry, which of course is one big kind of consumer of American soybeans, are actually trying to see whether they could replace or decrease the soybeans in the animal feed mix. So that's in a way would of course change a lot of the landscape of soybean trade between China and the U.S. And when that is in place in the next few months, if not years, then we would really see a kind of thing, a total landscape change, and which you cannot come back in a few years' time. And the second point for the voters is that a lot of has been said by the Trump administration that this would bring back our jobs, our employment, our salaries, so on and so forth. That's not going to happen because as we have seen that this would increase tax and there was a disrupted trade, and this would not, if you don't import from China, it will come from somewhere else. If you don't sell China, you don't find an easy place to sell. So jobs are not coming back, and salaries are not coming back. So that's the very lesson I think the U.S. Taxpayers are going to learn in a very hard way in the next few months.
And Yan Liang, I've got a quick question for you. Parag Khanna is coming out with a new book. It's got a provocative title, The Future is Asian. He's arguing that Trump pushing America first is actually going to accelerate Asia first. He writes that what you're going to see is Asian countries are going to integrate more to offset the U.S. tariffs. That'll permanently substitute U.S. components as they rise up the value chain. Is that a real risk for the United States? I mean, this is a gamble that Donald Trump's taking. Could it backfire on him?
I think to some degree, yes, that's correct. I think that's true because the United States is waging sort of trade tensions, not just with China, but with a lot of different countries. And you could also see that China is seeking more alliances with countries like Japan, South Korea, Russia, and so on and so forth. So it is possible that, this kind of American first agenda is actually going to backfire. And also the other thing is it might actually push China to slow down its reform. In some ways, I think, this this is really not an effective strategy if Trump is trying to make China open more and reform faster.
Yan Liang, thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists. A robust discussion. Really appreciate it. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.